Alright guys, I got this thing all the way torn apart and I must say, I'm pretty impressed. This engine spent like over a minute at basically 0 oil pressure, and a lot of that time was at over 6,000 RPM. The more and more that we do with these motors, the more and more that I am impressed with them. We've committed far smaller sins on LS engines and had far greater consequences. Alright guys, if you've been following the channel this year, you'll know that we built a 1974 Datsun 260Z and we installed a Twin Turbo Ameri-Barra Vortec 4200, and that happens to be what I'm sitting on right now. Now, we built that car for the No Name Nationals, which took place in September, and we didn't fare too well. We had a transmission failure actually on both cars that we took to that event, and I was frankly so disgusted by the whole deal that I tore the engine and transmission out of the car, and it's been sitting in the corner here to kind of let it think about what it did. But I've finally worked up the nerve to figure out what the heck happened with this deal, and we're gonna kind of tear some of this apart and figure out what the heck happened. So let's get this transmission separated and drain the fluid out of it, check that out, and then get this engine up onto a stand and have a look at how it's doing. Alright guys, here's a quick little tip. Anytime you're draining the fluid out of something that you suspect is damaged, it's a good idea to clean out your drain bucket so that you don't get like a false positive. Basically, you want to get all the garbage that might already be in your drain bucket out, so that when you drain the fluid out of the transmission, the garbage that is already in there doesn't make you think that there was garbage in the transmission. For this particular transmission, I think it's going to be pretty obvious that there's something wrong, so it's probably not as important on this one, but it's always good practice. Alright, so I popped the drain plug off and it has a little magnet on there, and it doesn't look like there's too much crap on there. And as the fluid is draining out, it also doesn't look like it's that ugly. I mean, it's a little bit black, but not quite as bad as I was expecting, but just give you a look at the drain plug here. And there's a little bit of metal on there, but I mean, you know, I don't think there's enough on there that it wouldn't, you know, run. All right, there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about with the transmission that I have here. We have been going through a learning process with the transmissions. Ever since we knocked the thrust bearing out on the first engine that was in the Datsun, we've been a little gun shy with doing that again. And because of that, we've been worried about the issue, or the alleged issue, where if you build too much torque converter charge pressure, it will push the torque converter forward and push the crankshaft forward, which will knock your thrust out. Because of that, we did something dumb. We put a adjustable pressure regulator on the pump of this transmission, and we set that pressure regulator to basically 175 psi. And this could be entirely why the transmission failed. Additionally, we actually installed this little regulator here onto the transmission, and that was in an attempt to regulate the converter charge pressure. We went to the Haltech World Cup Finals down at MIR this past November. And we met up with some guys who were actually some fans of ours, and they let me take a gander at their data. And what they had was a 2JZ with a compound turbo setup and a Transbrake Turbo 400. They were monitoring the transmission line pressure and the converter charge pressure. They, with an aftermarket case, they were able to put the line pressure at like 300 PSI. I think we're way off on our line pressure setting, but also they showed me the converter charge pressure, and at high RPM, they were getting 125 PSI of converter charge pressure. And they've never had a thrust bearing issue. So I think we'll keep running this charge pressure regulator, but it might not even be necessary. All right, on to the engine teardown. Before we tear the engine down, let's first explain why we're tearing it down at all. Basically, when the car was coasting down and it was experiencing a lot of negative G's, the oil was running away from the oil pickup in the sump. Since it's a rather long and wide sump, this is relatively easy for it to do. And if you check out the middle plot in our data log, the red line is oil pressure, and for a good 10 seconds or so, it basically lost oil pressure. And this happened every single pass that we made with the car, which there was about 7 passes on that engine. Obviously, running your engine without oil pressure is not a good thing, so let's tear it apart and check it out. So this engine is likely hurt, but what I'm really hoping is we can save the forged connecting rods out of the thing. So we're gonna tear the oil pan off of this and have a look. Also, I'd like to take the head off. Yeah, we're gonna lose a head gasket, but I'd like to check out how the pistons and the bores are doing. And since we're basically gonna have to start over with a whole new block and crank, likely, we're gonna have to do that anyways. So, all right, let's drain the oil and have a look. Guys, I got this thing all the way torn apart, and I must say, I'm pretty impressed. This engine spent like over a minute at basically 0 oil pressure, and a lot of that time was at over 6,000 RPM. Granted, it wasn't under load. I am like almost tempted to reuse the bearings because they look so good. The more and more that we do with these motors, the more and more that I am impressed with them. We've committed far smaller sins on LS engines and had far greater consequences. And I think it just comes down to the architecture of an inline 6. Now, some of you might be like, oh, there he goes again, telling us how this inline 6 is better than an LS. Well, there's a lot of qualities about it that are better than an LS. Now, one thing that I think is a little bit concerning is the amount of wear that we see on the pistons. I stuck the piston into the bore upside down and ran a feeler gauge around the outside edge, and I can get a 0.008 feeler gauge in between the skirt and the cylinder wall. So we are either scuffing the piston so bad that it's wearing away the side of the piston, or we are starting to collapse the piston. Now, granted, with the aftermarket rods, they eliminate the piston oil squirters. On our 824 horsepower stock bottom end attempt, when we pulled those pistons out, they looked mint. and none of the cylinder walls were scuffed or anything. Like, it looked fantastic. So obviously there was a reason that they added those. So I'd say we definitely got lucky. We didn't damage our forged connecting rods, and frankly, this is probably all reusable. I was expecting to lose a crankshaft and a block, and it really looks like all we really lost was a little bit of time and maybe an oil pump. So we'll probably throw this back together. My dad and I are toying with the idea of throwing a stock rod and piston back into this block and trying to set an even lower stock bottom end record. But let me know what you guys think. Do you think we should keep pushing the forged rod, maybe throw a set of forged pistons into it? Or do you think it would be cooler to put a totally factory rod and piston into it? I still think that we could go 7s with a factory rod and piston. It just might be a little more of a challenge. So with that, I think I'm gonna wrap the video up here. If you thought this video was a good video, maybe share it around. Maybe we could ruffle a few more feathers in the LS community. I'm really impressed with this motor, guys. I'm not just saying that because, you know, it benefits me. Like, honestly, we've done a lot of stuff with a lot of motors, and this is a pretty tough one. So with that, make sure you like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring the bell, maybe hit the join button, buy a t-shirt, and we'll see you in the next one.